Hi everyone, this is virtual lesson number 3 on the Concerto Through Time. So today's lesson is going to be carrying on with where we were before, which is in the Baroque period, so the 17th century, the first half of the 18th century, and we're continuing to look at the instruments in the orchestra that were performing concertos. This week, the key learning points for you are going to be understanding in a bit more depth what the orchestra roles were, so what the specific roles were for certain instruments within the orchestra. And we're also going to look at a specific type of structure which was called Ritornello Form. And this ties in because Ritornello Form enabled composers to show off the different instruments, and so it really maximised the effectiveness of their different roles. So to get started, we are going to look at a recording of a performance of a concerto grosso that was written by Bach. You might have heard of these. Bach wrote a set of 6 concerto grossos, and the plural for concerto grossos is concerti grossi. So he wrote 6 of them, and they are called the Brandenburg concertos, or the Brandenburg Concerti Grossi, and he was commissioned to write them by the Marquess of Brandenburg, which is a region in Germany, and each concerto grosso has a different set of solo instruments in the concertino, which is quite interesting. So, for example, the one I'm going to show you today is the Brandenburg Concerto number 4, which has 2 flutes or recorders, so you can play it on flute or recorder, and 1 violin. So there are 3 soloists in the concertino. But for example, in the second one, so Brandenburg Concerto number 2, it is for a trumpet, recorder, oboe and violin. So there's 4 in that one. For the first one, there are tons of soloists. I think there are 6 or 7. So it's like they're so numerous, it's almost like a symphony orchestra. Like there's just so much going on. It's almost not really a concerto at all because you don't get that much contrast between the soloists and the rest of the orchestra. So anyway, we're going to look at number 4 because it's a good example of a concerto grosso where you've got 3 soloists at the front and then you've got the rest of the orchestra behind. But you'll see in the video that the rest of the orchestra, the ripieno, is very small and it's actually just strings and a harpsichord. You always had a harpsichord accompanying. This one has only got strings in the orchestra. There aren't any wind or brass instruments. But still, the way the music has been composed, it gives the limelight a lot of the time to the soloists, and you'll see how that happens as we watch. So I'm going to go through it with you, and we're going to use this video as our sort of spotlight and point of reference to learn about the different roles of the different instruments. Okay, so hopefully that has given you a better understanding of what a concerto grosso performance was like, and you could see the contrasts that were achieved by having these different sections in the music where the soloists were very prominent and just being accompanied by quite a sparse backing. So the music in the background was maybe, for example, just a chord on the first beat of the bar, and the soloists were really doing most of the work with the melodies. But then other sections when the whole orchestra was sort of all playing together, and you had quite a recognisable theme that kept sort of coming back, a bit like a chorus. And this was part of your research homework from last week, to think about how the composers built up the dynamics, because the instruments themselves weren't that capable of changing dynamics. They weren't sophisticated enough. And hopefully that example has shown you the way that composers achieved a build-up. It was by playing around with the texture. And so actually by having fewer instruments playing at one time, you could create a quieter dynamic. And then in order to build up the dynamic, to make it louder, you would bring more and more instruments from the ripieno in until you had a section where everybody was playing all again, the full orchestra, and that would be at its loudest. And there is a term for that, which is an important term for you to learn, and it is called terraced dynamics. And terracing is kind of all about layers and the building up of layers. And so terraced dynamics is a phrase that you need to become familiar with. And that is how you achieved contrast. But the difference between these different sections and these different groups was very important, because it gave, as you saw, the soloists opportunities to have long solo passages where they were really showing off. But then it also gave the piece structure and a theme, because you keep coming back to this same musical idea, a bit like a chorus. And I'm using the word chorus deliberately because in pop music, we're familiar with the structure or form of a verse chorus. So we go verse, then we might have another verse, then chorus, then verse, then chorus, then we have a bridge. You know, structure and form helps bring musical pieces together and make them complete and make them interesting. And in Baroque music, particularly with the concerto, this specific structure developed, which was called Ritornello Form. Now, Ritornello in Italian means a little return, Ritornello. And that little return is this recurring passage that keeps coming back, just like a chorus. And as this style of Ritornello Form developed, it became quite specific. It was Vivaldi actually who really established a set of conventions for it, where the ritornello, or the chorus, the ritornello section would have the full orchestra playing, and that would alternate with what were called episodes for the soloist or soloist on its own when it was just a concerto. The opening ritornello would be quite long and might have several sort of small units or segments, and then you would have your first episode for a soloist to show off. So we saw that the first episode was for our violinist. Then you would have little ritornellos, so little returns, little bursts of that main theme, sort of making the audience not quite sure when it was going to come back, but just reminding them of it. And then you would have a full return of the ritornello before another solo passage. So we saw that happen. It came back, but it was in the minor key, so it was a little bit contrasting. And then we had our next episode, which was for the different soloist this time. It was for the two recorders. So what you really need to remember are those terms, that you have a ritornello, which is like a chorus, and that is when everybody plays. And then that alternates with solo passages, which are called episodes. So the ritornellos and the episodes. And in the ritornello sections, the final Italian word I want you to learn is the word tutti, and that means all. So when an orchestra is playing, if it's tutti, it means that the full orchestra are playing, and the ritornello section, the chorus section, would always be the full orchestra, because that sounded the grandest and the loudest and the most important, and that was playing out our theme. And then in the episodes, where you would have a soloist, or if you were in a concerto grosso, the different solo instruments might take turns or do little bits. So we've had the recorders playing a sort of duet section, and that would show off their virtuosity, and it would be accompanied by a very stripped down backing. So normally not the full orchestra, but always the harpsichord with the cello. So this brings us on to the other learning point of today's lesson, which is about the orchestral roles. And obviously Ritornello Form enabled the audience to benefit from being able to hear these longer solo episodes and hear the virtuosic playing, but also enjoy and recognise the piece by having this returning chorus, this ritornello section. And so it helped them follow and then recognise pieces. It gave music a kind of signature. It became recognisable, well, that's the Brandenburg Concerto. I recognise that idea. And the soloists, as you saw, are very important throughout. They're really leading the whole ensemble. But the other instrument that you will have noticed, I obviously mention a lot, and is there all the way through the piece, is the harpsichord. So when you have your ritornello section, which is tutti, so the full orchestra is playing, the harpsichord is involved and is playing, obviously, because everybody is. But equally, in your episodes, when you've just got the soloist or soloists, and maybe at some stages some of the ripieno, but not all, you always have the harpsichord. The harpsichord plays all the way through. And the role of the harpsichord is one of the most important things you need to learn about the Baroque period. Pretty much all Baroque instrumental music was accompanied by a harpsichord. And not only a harpsichord on its own, but typically you would have a cello or occasionally another low instrument, so a bassoon could do the job, and sometimes an instrument called a viola da gamba, which was like a string instrument that was somewhere between a viola and a cello that died out pretty quickly. That instrument would play along with the harpsichord, so 90% of the time it was the harpsichord with the cello, and together they formed the fundamental part of the bass line to all Baroque instrumental music. And it had a specific name, which was the basso continuo, which in Italian means the continuing bass line. And The purpose of the basso continuo was to help shift the music through all these different chords. We talked last lesson about the fact that the music was very explorative, and that this whole concept about having lots of different keys and chords that you would move through and it would just go on and on, that was very important, and that was a real driver in the momentum of the Baroque music. And therefore having a bass line that really clearly established and sort of anchored the whole piece together and helped you hear those changing chords was very, very important. And the basso continuo worked around the idea that the composer would compose a bass line and write it out in notes for the left hand of the harpsichord and the cello, or occasionally viola da gamba or bassoon, that was playing along with it. So the two of them together would both play the same bass line. And in this Baroque painting that you've got on the screen, I chose this painting as a good example because you can see that the cellist is actually sitting just behind the harpsichord player and reading off the same music. So they were playing the same thing. They would play a bass line. And a bass line is, the same principle we have nowadays in a pop song, which you would have played on the bass guitar. And it underpins the whole piece. It's low down. It gives you the root note of the chord or the bass note of the chord, and it helps really sort of structure the harmony and drive the music forwards with all your fancy melodies and fluttery stuff going on over the top. And what was particularly interesting about the basso continuo's role was that whilst the cello or the bassoon would just play single notes at a time, obviously just follow the bass line, the harpsichord player was expected to do something really difficult, and that was to improvise an elaborate piece, an elaborate part over the top. So you would have the notes that had to be included and that generally you would play with your left hand. But over the top of that, you were expected to embellish and improvise, basically, as you went along, chords and extra twiddly passages and melodies. And this wouldn't be written out in your music. You would just have the bass line. But in order to help you, composers did use something called figured bass. And so underneath the bass notes on the score would be figures or numbers. And these numbers were a sort of code that would tell the harpsichord player which chords they were meant to be playing. Because obviously a single note on its own doesn't necessarily tell you what chords you've got. For example, if you've got the note C on your score, that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole orchestra is playing the chord of C major. They could be playing the chord of C minor. They could also be playing a different chord that has a C in it. So an F major chord is FAC. An A minor chord is ACE. There are different possibilities. So in order for the harpsichord player to have the information that they needed in order to improvise this elaborate music underneath the rest of the orchestra, they would have figured bass, and those figures were a code that would tell them which chord they should be using in their improvisation. So it was a very, very challenging, difficult thing to be able to do. So harpsichord players were extremely talented, and it was very, very difficult. And it was really up to them how elaborate they made their piece. So what was quite interesting was that if, for example, you had some soloists who weren't particularly great, the harpsichord player could be really fancy and really complex and do all sorts of stuff to try and sort of beef out the piece and cover up the fact that the soloists weren't as good. Or if you had a really virtuosic, really, really amazing soloist who was just doing phenomenal things, the harpsichord player would keep their part relatively simple. They might just play the chords. They might not do too much twiddly melodic stuff because they didn't want to distract from the soloist. In that example that we saw before with the recorders, I pointed out that during the recorders' sort of duet passage, their episode, the harpsichord player was doing quite a lot of melodic stuff, quite complex stuff, and that might have been because he just felt he needed to sort of beef up that section a little bit. When the violinist was doing their solo, that was a really sort of elaborate, showy-offy solo that the violinist was doing. We didn't need the harpsichord part to be that elaborate. So yeah, it was a very specific thing that they did. As I said, it was very challenging, and it is a fundamental part of all instrumental music in the Baroque that you had this basso continuo. It is sometimes just called continuo, or referred to as a continuo, and within the orchestra, within the ripieno, the harpsichord and cellist were known as the continuo part, but they obviously were still part of the orchestra as well. They just had a very specific role in what they did. So I'm now going to include a short clip of another video with two musicians who are talking about the basso continuo and doing some examples to kind of demonstrate how you could improvise over your figured bass and make a continuo part different.
Basso continuo is something we hear about a lot in Baroque music, and it's completely essential to understanding this repertoire. If you don't know exactly what that means, it's usually the bass line of a piece with figures or figured bass to sort of indicate which harmonies you're going to be playing. If you play a sustained instrument like a cello, viola da gamba, or a bassoon, you'll play just the bass line. But if you play a chordal instrument like a harpsichord or a lute, you're going to fill out all of the harmonies indicated by the figures.
So as Emily just explained, continuo playing is something that for cellists and viola da gambists means playing the bass line, and they, with a chordal instrument like a harpsichord or a lute, is going to fill out the full texture above that, which is a really important part of this music. All Baroque music relies on this, and the reason that composers didn't write this out is they needed to have flexibility to accompany the soloists that they were accompanying.
Okay, so we've got to the end of the video, and I want us just to reflect on the learning points for today, which was to get your head around the roles of the different instruments within the orchestra, and also the way that contrast was created through Ritornello Form as a specific structure in the Baroque period. Now, not all pieces always used Ritornello Form. However, on your exam, if you have a question on a Baroque concerto and it asks you to discuss the form or say what form you've heard, I think it's sort of 99% likely that it would be Ritornello Form that they would use as an example. When we study the classical concerto, there are some other forms that we will look at then, that occasionally versions of those could be used in the Baroque, but basically Ritornello was very, very popular. So Ritornello Form is the structure that you should revise in association with the Baroque period. And as you can see on the video screen, you have got a sort of grid outlining how all these different parts and sections correspond to one another. So you have got your blue column, which is your Ritornello section, And then you've got your yellow column, which is your episode section, where you have your solo passages, and those alternate, as we discussed earlier in the video. The green words are the ones that are the specific terms that I need you to really focus on, and you need to know all of these off by heart and what they mean. So within the Ritornello sections and the episode sections, so throughout the piece, you have got your rows which show you which instruments you have. So you will always have in a concerto either one soloist or a group of soloists, and when there's the group, it's a concerto grosso, and that group is called the concertino. Now, the soloists play throughout. During the Ritornello sections, they play with the orchestra, but they stand out a lot and play kind of fancier, more elaborate stuff. And then during the episodes, it's their chance to really show off their virtuosic playing. Now, in a concerto grosso, as we saw today, when you've got more than one soloist, when you've got a concertino, in different episodes, they sort of take it in turns to have the limelight and to have a solo. Now, the rest of the orchestra is the ripieno, and it's string dominated. In our example today, it was only strings, but you might have some wind and some brass, not very many. And in the Ritornello section, they all play. So it is a tutti orchestra, it's the full orchestra. And they rarely play at all in the episode sections, because otherwise they would be too loud and too dominant and you wouldn't hear the soloists properly. Sometimes you have some writing for the ripieno, and we saw an example of that with the terrace dynamics, that more and more of the ripieno started coming in with the soloists, so it sort of built up the texture and built up the dynamics, and then we returned to the Ritornello with everybody. And similarly, within the ripieno, within the accompanying orchestra, you have a specific role for the harpsichord and usually a cello, and that is called the basso continuo. And they play throughout. They accompany everybody in the Ritornello section, which is when everyone is playing, but they also continue to play in the episodes, the solo passages, and they accompany the soloist. And we looked at today the fact that the harpsichord player within the basso continuo, the harpsichord player was actually improvising the music that they played, and they could be flexible and change how elaborate and how twiddly the music was that they were playing in relation to what the soloist was doing at the time. So that is how it all fits together. I know it's a lot of information to be thrown at you. Ritornello form, as I just said, is the only form we are going to look at with regards to the Baroque, and it's one that you just need to know the name of, and you need to know that you have a Ritornello section and an episode section. You don't need to go into more detail than that. You won't be required, for example, to listen to a passage and pick out, exactly how long or specifically when the Ritornello section bit was or the episode bit was. The most you would have to write about this is if you had a Baroque concerto for your paragraph question, so your question 3 on the paper, where you have to write a chronological paragraph. And if you cottoned on to the fact that it was a concerto grosso and it was in Ritornello form, and you could hear these tutti sections contrasting with sort of solo sections, episodes, using the words Ritornello and episode and tutti in your answer would pretty much guarantee you full marks. It would be very impressive. But that's the most detail you're going to have to be going into. So don't panic too much, especially if you find it hard to hear the difference between the sections. You will get more used to it, but it's not something you need to be able to analyse in a huge amount of detail. What you do need to be really clear on is the fact that in your concertos you had your soloists or soloist, and you had the rest of the orchestra, but within the rest of the orchestra, you had a very important role in the basso continuo. And you can, again, mention, particularly in a paragraph question, you can mention the fact that the basso continuo's notated music was a little bit different, and as well as the bass line, they had figures or numbers written underneath to help them, and that it was improvised. But the most important word in all of that is the basso continuo, or just continuo part. And that is how it all fitted together.